Today we are technically doing our Christmas episode, but this is not your average Christmas episode as we are celebrating Geek Christmas. What is Geek Christmas, you ask? Well, we are still celebrating a birth, but the birth celebrated on Geek Christmas is not Christ, but rather Marvel Comics Stan the Man Lee, who was born on December 28th, 1922. Stan Lee co-created Spider-Man, the Hulk, Doctor Strange, Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Daredevil, Thor, the X-Men, and many others. Lee led the expansion of Marvel Comics from a small division of a publishing house to a large multimedia corporation. I mean, if there was a Mount Rushmore of comic book creators, Stan Lee would be headlining it. Pun intended.
Oh, no doubt. Stan Lee was involved in creating so many iconic characters, like you mentioned, in addition to building the Marvel Universe as we know it today. He was also the main editor at Marvel for many years, and he's probably instrumental in bringing the MU to the screen, which was a dream of his that took decades to finally accomplish. Stan probably had a hand in almost everything we love about Marvel today, and he definitely should be honored for that.
Well, I hope that we can honor him today as we celebrate Stan Lee's birthday on Geek Christmas. Now, while DC was the first to bring their heroes together on a team with Justice Society, Stan Lee was the first to introduce a thoroughly shared universe into superhero comic books. Throughout his career, he has been an editor, as you already mentioned, executive vice president, publisher, and the face of Marvel Comics. He not only wrote the comics, he even narrated the animated series that Marvel put out. Stan would often refer to his faithful fans as true believers, and my Saturday morning was just not complete until I heard him call us that.
Oh, yeah. Stan Lee was a really great promoter, and he basically created the entire identity of Stan Lee that we know and love. It might surprise people today, but there's an old picture of Stan in the 1960s where he's balding, clean-shaven, and wearing a suit, which is a far cry from the wig and outfits we see him in during his later years. Stan was reinventing himself before that even became a thing. And it absolutely worked. I mean, he was a friendly face for the kids to latch onto, and he had a way to speaking that made people think he was talking to them. To this day, I cannot imagine anybody who can communicate about comics the way that Stan did.
He really did have the ability to get a listener excited about what he was talking about. He just brings an enthusiasm and a surety that make him a natural salesman and marketer. But Stan was not always Stan the Man Lee. Stanley Lieber was born in his family Manhattan apartment to a Romanian immigrant dad and an American mom, and grew up in poverty during the Great Depression. At the age of 17, he got a job through his uncle Robbie Solomon and his cousin Jean, who was Martin Goodman's wife, at a pulp fiction outfit called Timely Publications, just as the new medium of comic books were coming into being. In those days, the artists dipped their pens in ink, so Stan had to make sure that their ink wells were full, and he also went down and got them their lunch, did proofreading, erased the pencils from the finished pages, that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah. Well, today this would be considered nepotism. In the case of Stan, he really earned his way up on merit and talent. I mean, he paid his dues on the way up like everybody else did.
Well, there was also a bit of natural talent meeting the right place at the right time going on there with Joe Simon and Jack Kirby leaving in 1941. I mean, they had a dispute with Goodman a little bit, and as they were the only two people in that department, that left 19-year-old Stan Lee as the comic book division's editor-in-chief, as well as the art director until 1972, when he would succeed Goodman as publisher.
Stan was always the obvious heir apparent to the Marvel Empire at that point. Not only was he keeping things in the family, as it were, he had pretty much become the face of the bullpen by that point. Stan was always charismatic, which helped attract and keep talent, and he was always serious about what made a good comic book. Just to give an example, there's a video on YouTube, an old one, where Stan is giving critical feedback to Todd McFarlane and Rob Liefeld on the design for a character that became known as Overkill. Todd would later use this character in a run on Spawn. The original idea was so 90s and ridiculous, the way that they had laid it out in the video, but Stan was brutal in his criticisms while also using humor to get his points across. All in all, I think Stan probably made Overkill a much better character by the time he appeared in Spawn. But only Stan Lee could rip a character idea by two of the hottest artists of the 90s at their prime and come across looking like the nicest guy around. but that was the kind of guy, the editor and publisher that Marvel needed at that time.
I've seen that, and I totally know what you're saying. He definitely had that thing where he was being really, really critical, but somehow it didn't come across jerky or condescending. Stan just has that like perma nice guy thing going on. Considering that Stan's destiny was clearly comics and not novels, it's a little funny to think that Lieber felt that someday he would write the great American novel, and he didn't want to use his real name on silly little comic books. So because of that, he used the pen name Stan Lee when he started writing for the company's new book Captain America in 1941. His first story was Captain America Foils the Traitor's Revenge. In Captain America, this was in Captain America #3 in 1941, an all-text story, actually. It was in this story that Captain America first threw his ricocheting shield. When the creators of that iconic character, writers Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, left Timely Publications at the end of that year in 1941, 19-year-old Stanley Lieber suddenly found himself as the editor of the whole operations for a good 3.5 decades, over which Timely Publications changed its name to Atlas and then Marvel. However, there were a few years of wartime service where Lee enlisted into the U.S. Army during World War II and ended up working for the Signal Corps as a playwright. He served as the U.S. Army training in the U.S. Army Training Film Division, writing manuals, training films, slogans, and cartoons under the military classification of playwright.
Oh yeah, I mean, a lot of the people at that time really were involved in the military and in the war effort, and Stan was no exception. And he also wrote in a lot of different genres too, like many writers of the 40s and 50s. He wrote war comics and romance comics, western, science fiction, horror, and more. When Timely Comics became Atlas, the focus shifted to anthology-based stories that were popular at the time, much like you would see with Twilight Zone and whatnot later. But many of those titles were the precursors to books that we might know today. Journey into Mystery, which introduced Thor, Tales of Astonish, where Hulk and Ant-Man debuted, and Tales of Suspense, which Captain America and Iron Man took over later. Also, Stan was involved with characters like Fin Fang Foom, Kid Colt, Millie the Model, and others. If he didn't write some of those characters at the time, he certainly brought them back later when he was writing in Marvel, including characters like Patsy Walker, who later became Hellcat.
Stan definitely did a lot of work before 1961, but by 1961, Stan felt that comics were just simple kid stories with no real character development or depth of thought. And Stan Lee was ready to quit writing comics because of the content of the stories he was being asked to write. But then two things happened that would change Stan Lee's life. The first was publisher Martin Goodwin heard about the strong sales of the JLA, or I guess Justice Society title, and told Stan Lee to create a comic book series about a team of superheroes. The second was Stan Lee told his wife, Joan, that he felt like he was going nowhere writing comics and he wanted to quit. And she encouraged him to give it one more shot, but this time to do it the way he wanted to write them. After all, if he was going to quit anyway, what did he have to lose? So working with artist Jack the King Kirby, Stan Lee came up with the Fantastic Four, and by November of 1961, the Marvel Age of Comics was born. A universe where the characters had depth, story arc, and real problems. In short, Stan was finally writing what he wanted to write after all those years, and it paid off. Because of the quick success of the Fantastic Four, Stan Lee was able to pump out a plethora of characters and filled an entire universe with some of the most well-known characters on the earth.
Oh yeah, I think that was the Justice League issue that caused him to get into the Fantastic Four, or led to the creation of it. And really the Fantastic Four is one of Stan's greatest achievements, though he and Kirby drew on influences from pulp science fiction stories of the 40s and 50s. The FF themselves drew noticeably on the Skylark novels by a writer called E. Doc Smith, who is best known for the Lensman series, which became an influence on Green Lantern, or the Hal Jordan version of Green Lantern. Skylark gave us the idea of a family of space travelers, including scientist Richard Seaton, his later wife Dorothy, and his best friend Martin Crane, who created an experimental spaceship. The Skylark crew would overcome villains, including alien empires and even cosmic beings. All that started with Skylark. Also, Reed Richards does sound like a take on Richard Seaton. Even the character of Doctor Doom draws a lot from Skylark's villain, Mark Blackie Duquesne, though the name Doctor Doom came from an obscure Golden Age character in the comics. Like Doom, Duquesne is a jealous rival of the hero. He's Seaton's intellectual equal. And also like Doom, he had facial scarring, operated by an unusual code of honor, and was likewise scheming, manipulative, and ruthless. In the later books, Duquesne ended up taking over an entire corporation and even made a play to become a god like Doom. And then by the end of the series, he actually ran his own space empire. Yeah, all of that was stuff that Stan put into the Fantastic Four. There's also a bit of Doc Savage and his Band of Iron as well, which Stan certainly would have read. Reed Richards fits the Doc Savage mold of hero very well. And like Doc, the FF hold up in a Manhattan high-rise building. Also, the dynamic between Ben and Johnny is much like Doc's associates Monk and Ham. And there's also a bit of Doom in Doc's archenemy, John Sunlight, as well. Like Doom, Sunlight is a villain who is vision-driven and with ambitions towards world domination. But what I think Stan brought to the FF and what separates the FF from their influences is that he brought heart and humanity to the idea. Doc Smith invented cosmic science fiction, but the characterization was mostly not his thing, aside from Duquesne, who was very complex. Doc Savage stories were often very formulaic. In fact, there's actually an article on exactly how to write a Doc Savage story. And so there weren't very deep character dives. But Stan understood that the strength of the FF was the family dynamic, and he wrote them in a way that looked like a believable family unit. He made Ben Grimm into a tragic hero, although Ben probably took a lot out from Jack Kirby. Reed was a scientist with a heart. He cared about his family. His love for Sue felt genuine. Johnny was a romantic hero as well as an impulsive kid. And while it took other writers to develop Sue's personality, Stan laid the foundation for what was there. And he did give Sue her force field powers, which were a big, big key to her later development. The characters and their relationships just made the FF something different, especially for its time.
That is so true. When I think of the Fantastic Four, I don't think about their powers or even their rogues gallery necessarily. I think about their characters and their relationships with each other. I mean, that is what makes it good. I think that the same thing could be said of X-Men on a lesser scale. It was the characterization and relationships that kept us coming back.
Oh, yeah, very much so. We care about Reed's guilt for creating the team and turning Ben into a monster. We care about Ben and Johnny constantly bickering and pranking each other, but coming together as friends at the end. We care about Sue trying to keep the guys from killing each other. The X-Men are probably closer to a found family, while the FF have actual familial ties, but the end result is the same.
Beyond humanizing superheroes and making them three-dimensional characters, which is something Lee did throughout his creations, there's another common factor in a lot of Lee's characters, and that is the city and state of New York. Lee said that he tried to make out characters that all live in the same world, and whenever possible, he had them live in the same city, New York. This made it very easy for him to have a guest star, and he didn't have to dream up some silly reason why they would get together because they lived in the same city. And to this day, Marvel Comics and the MCU are a New York-centered universe.
That's very true. Stan always intended the Marvel Universe to be the world outside your window. So Stan used the world he knew as a lifelong New Yorker, and he used it to flesh out the world he built. Some of these real locations would feel alive in these stories, and some would even be closely identified with the Marvel heroes. It's hard to imagine Spider-Man outside of Queens or Daredevil without his haunting grounds of Hell's Kitchen.
Right? They're definitely tied to those places. I've actually heard people who live in New York talk about their personal connections with some of the Marvel characters, specifically Spider-Man, but just because of where they're from. I mean, they see Spider-Man fighting in the train yards with the bad guy, and they walk by those same train yards every day. It's like, it was really just pure genius to do that, to provide that connection in their universe.
Oh, absolutely. All in all, I think it's fair to say that Stan co-created most of the Marvel characters that have become iconic. Spider-Man, the FF, the Hulk, the Avengers, and so many more began with Stan. And so many others first appeared in titles written by Stan later on. I mean, including the Black Panther, the Silver Surfer, the Inhumans, the Falcon, Captain Marvel, and more. Interestingly enough, though, the Silver Surfer became a character that Stan was strongly attached to. Even though Kirby was definitely the driving force in creating the Surfer, there's a little bit of controversy there, but I mean, it's generally assumed that Kirby did most of the work. Stan wrote a number of Surfer stories, though, later, drawn by John Buscema, using the Surfer to make social commentary on the issues of the time.
My understanding is that it was Lee's more intellectual approach to his characters, especially the Silver Surfer, that were one of the driving forces in bringing in adult readers, in particular the college-age people. Stan would often talk at colleges, and Silver Surfer was one of the things that got brought up all the time.
I said that's probably true. Stan used the Surfer to go into more philosophical territory, and he said things that probably resonate with readers at the time. Surfer was a character who valued peace and enlightenment, always pointing out what didn't make sense about modern society. Probably college-age readers would have connected with that, especially in the time of peace, love, and Woodstock.
Right. It wasn't just the Silver Surfer titles that brought a thought-provoking content for adult Marvel readers. Stan Lee also helped weaken censorship in mainstream comics field after a formal request by the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. He decided to do a story about the problem of drug use. The story he wrote in 1971 for The Amazing Spider-Man concerned Peter Parker's friend Harry Osborn having a bad trip on LSD and nearly dying from it. You can tell, obviously, that Stan never did any drugs whatsoever when you read the story, but I mean, it works just as well. The Comics Code Authority declared that they would not give their seal of approval for the 3-issue arc on the grounds that the code, which was notorious for being draconian, would not allow the depiction of drug use, even when it's portrayed negatively. Confident that the original government request would give him the credibility he needed, and with the support of his publisher, Martin Goodman, Lee decided to defy the CCA and publish the story as is without the seal, and received healthy sales and positive public reaction for his efforts in portraying the social problem. Soon after, the CCA changed their rules to allow for anti-drug messages in comics.
Yeah, Stan definitely made the right decision there. I mean, this really was a case where the CCA was standing in the way of an anti-drug message, and it was acting against its own interests and goals. I'm in favor of stories that show the negative consequences of substance abuse. Dangerous Habits and Hellblazer is a great example of this, and I think that's always better than just banning those kinds of stories. I think Stan understood that, and he was on the right side of the issue on this. Oh, yeah. Gradually, Stan moved away from actively writing the comics, and he grew into more of an editing role. He would leave the stories to other writers, most often Roy Thomas, who he worked with closely towards the end of the Silver Age. Thomas probably had the most notable success on Avengers, where he had perhaps had a better run than Stan did. And as an editor, Stan oversaw the creative surge during the early Bronze Age. He wanted to move just beyond straight superhero and into other genres, including science fiction, martial arts, and horror. Stan was a strong supporter of titles like Tomb of Dracula, for example, which began the Marvel horror titles of the 70s. And even when he wasn't writing the books himself, he believed in supporting the creative visions of his writers and making sure the books were as good as he could make them. Now, eventually, Stan moved on from editorial and he became publisher of Marvel Comics. And after a while, Stan really became more of a figurehead, more of a goodwill ambassador for Marvel Comics and for comics in general. Much of his interest moved to adapting Marvel books for television and film rather than comics, although he would dip his toes back into comics from time to time. But he never lost his love for comics as a medium in his entire life, really, even if he was opening doors elsewhere. Stan did, though, create some characters for Marvel on and off, even into the early 90s. He created the She-Hulk in 1980 with Jennifer Walters as the cousin of Bruce Banner. He created a minor character called Nightcat, who was based loosely on an actual cosplayer for Marvel named Jacqueline Tavares. She had been hired to do conventions for Marvel, so he built a character around her. His last creation for Marvel, though, was Ravage 2099, which Stan created for the 2099 Cyberpunk superhero line, along with Spider-Man 2099, Doom 2099, and the X-Men 2099. Ravage was like the only one that was an original character. But unfortunately, Ravage was probably the least remembered of the 2099 characters. But the 2099 line was successful at the time, all in all. And in addition, Stan also did other things. He wrote another Silver Surfer story for Marvel called The Enslavers in 1990. But after that, really, most of Stan's work was in TV and film, though occasionally he would do independent comics projects. One show that he was involved in that I really thought was a cool idea was Who Wants to Be a Superhero? Which was a superhero-based reality show. So he would bring these people, this group of people who would make up these superhero characters, play as them, and compete to see who was the best hero with Stan as the judge. It was really entertaining stuff, and I love that Stan always rewarded acts of heroism and good character on that show, which was not something you saw in reality shows very often.
I totally remember that show. It was very cool. I loved how Stan always appreciated imagination and originality, but as you said, he always brought it back to what it really meant to be a superhero.
Yeah, he never lost sight of any of that, and that's just scratching the surface of the things he was involved in. Stan was always active in different media projects until the end of his life, even though none of them had the impact that his Marvel work did. He was involved in comics aimed for kids. He was involved with a superhero line published by Virgin Comics. Some of them actually had recognizable names on them. I think Paul Cornell did one, for example. He also did YouTube and with different media companies and worked with manga and other things. Stan embraced just about every kind of media and technology, as well as social media, and he saw the creative possibilities in all of them, even to the end of his life.
He really was a man truly dedicated to comics. After his retirement from work at Marvel in the 90s, he was invited to do a limited edition series for DC Comics, Marvel's principal rival. The series, titled Just Imagine, presented the featured DC characters Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Flash, all with different backgrounds and stories as Stan Lee would have had them, and all with names, of course, that start with the same letter.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I did not read those, so I'm not sure how good they were, but they were some outstanding artists attached to this. They had Jim Lee, Gary Frank, John Cassaday, Joe Kubert, Chris Bacalo, Kevin McGuire, Dave Gibbons, John Byrne, Jerry Ordway, John Buscema, and Walt Simonson. If nothing else, I am sure they were great-looking books.
Yeah, they were pretty cool. That much I have to give them. Stan really was a multimedia kind of guy. If he hadn't landed the career he pursued, Stan Lee said he would have loved to have been an actor. That being up there on the screen seemed like it was about as much fun as a guy could have, and he got his chance due to his contract, which states that he has to appear in all movies with characters he created. Stan Lee had cameo appearances in many Marvel films and television projects, and many yet to come posthumously. Due to his advancing age, he shot several cameos ahead of upcoming movies just in case. The first of such posthumous cameos appeared in Captain Marvel 2019 movie, which has a special Marvel opening credit as a tribute.
Yeah, Stan always called himself the King of Cameos, a name that stuck after his many film appearances, and he definitely earned that. He probably has made more cameos than Alfred Hitchcock, who was well known for cameos in his own films. His MCU appearances may be the best known, but he appeared in numerous films out of Fox, Sony, and elsewhere.
So far, Stan Lee has appeared as a juror in a dream sequence in The Trial of the Incredible Hulk, as a hot dog vendor in X-Men, a man in a fair in Spider-Man, and an old man crossing the street in Daredevil, a security guard in Hulk, a man dodging debris in Spider-Man #2, Willie Lumpkin in Fantastic Four 2005. The first time he played an actual Marvel character, actually, was Willie Lumpkin. Waterhose Man in X-Men: The Last Stand, where it just had the water going up into the air. A man in Times Square in Spider-Man 3, a rejected wedding guest in Fantastic Four: The Rise of the Silver Surfer, one of my favorites, actually. I really loved that one. The man who Tony Stark mistakes for Hugh Hefner in Iron Man, and an uncredited appearance as the man who drinks a soft drink contaminated with Bruce Banner's blood in The Incredible Hulk, along with Lou Ferrigno. He is one of the two actors to appear in both Hulk and The Incredible Hulk. He was also in Captain America: The First Avenger as a U.S. Army general, but this is a partial exception, as he did not actually create Captain America, but he did create the character's signature move of throwing a shield and was at least partially responsible for successfully reviving him in the 1960s as a member of the Avengers.
Yeah, in addition to writing the Cap solo title for quite some time. Stan made so many great cameos over the years. If I had to pick some personal favorites, I'd have to list Willie Lumpkin in FF. Is there a Tony Stank epilogue in Civil War? And the scene where he's abandoned by the Watchers in Guardians of the Galaxy, which was funny. But it's hard to pick just one, because Stan is so much of the part of the Marvel Universe on film. He even did cameos outside the Marvel Universe. His cameo in Kevin Smith's Mallrats is fondly remembered by many, and even made appearances on The Simpsons.
Right. That Mallrats appearance was classic for sure. There are 5 X-Men films where Stan Lee doesn't appear in a cameo, and they are X-Men 2, X-Men United, X-Men Origins Wolverine, X-Men First Class, and X-Men Days of Future Past, and the 2020 film The New Mutants. When asked at conventions why he doesn't appear in these movies, in which his presence would obviously be expected, he usually responds, "Nobody asked me."
I find it so weird that Fox never brought him to do some of those films. I can understand New Mutants because Stan really was not involved in that book at all. That was mainly Chris Claremont and Louis Simonson. But the other X-Men films strike me as a bit odd. And Stan really did do other Fox X-Men films, including X-Men and Daredevil, and Deadpool, I'm sorry. He even appeared in the teaser trailer for Deadpool 2, which was funny. But as it is, he still cameoed in an impressive number of films.
That's for sure. Stan Lee was awarded the 2008 American National Medal of the Arts for his services to comic books and production. On Friday, October 28, 2016, the city of Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti declared that day, including the weekend of the 29th and the 30th, the first Stan Lee Day, to celebrate the 6th Stan Lee's Kamikaze Expo in 2012, rechristened Stan Lee's Los Angeles Comic-Con Today, held at the Los Angeles Downtown Convention Center. On the 16th of July in 2017, Lee was named a Disney Legend, which is a Hall of Fame program that recognizes individuals who have made extraordinary and integral contributions to the Walt Disney Company.
All well-deserved honors. Even though most of Stan's contributions came well before Disney bought Marvel, he certainly is a legend of the industry, and he definitely played a huge role on getting the Marvel Universe on screen. It's hard to think of too many people who contributed more to comics than Stan did during his lifetime.
So true. And that, my friend, is why we have declared Stan Lee's birthday Geek Christmas, and it is why we are here today. But that about wraps things up for our time here, and I want to thank you for listening, and I'd like you to share this episode if you liked it. I'd like to leave you with some parting words, and that is, Excelsior, true believer.